Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, a future of work consultancy. And Q, would you like to share about yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Q Hamirani. I am currently the Chief People Officer at Paper, which is an education tech company.
And we're going to talk about how hybrid work and remote work allows companies to do more with less. I've definitely been noticing that in terms of people are willing to take less money to work remotely at least part of the time, so hybrid modality or a fully remote modality. And of course, it also costs less in real estate, office-based services. So let's talk a little bit more about that. What have you been seeing? I work as a consultant, helping companies make the transition to hybrid work and remote work, but you work within companies, focusing within Paper, on facilitating hybrid work, remote work. You earlier worked with Airbnb. Tell me a little bit more about your experience first.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's kind of twofold experiences. One is while I was at Airbnb for the course of 5 years, we really transitioned from being an in-person company for the most part into a fully 100% remote company almost overnight because of the pandemic. So we went from in-person to for 2 years, from March of 2020 to April of 2022, we were completely remote. And that transition really helped us learn how remote work can succeed. So, just looking at doing more with less, there are pros and cons of both sides, like everything.
Sure.
So on the pro side of doing more with less, people don't have to commute. People don't have to really run around from building to building. So you're actually you're spending times, like literally my days would go by and I would just be back to back doing work, and literally you're teleporting yourself with Zoom London to a call in San Francisco to a call across the world. So I think doing more with less in that context is getting a lot of work done. Obviously, this does put the flip side of the equation, which is really being intentional and focusing on your well-being. Because I learned pretty early in the pandemic that I was just burning myself out after a few months of non-stop work when my desk was 2 feet from my bed. That was my commute, right? And sometimes it ended up being a really late night because my computer is right there. I could just do work. Like, it's not like I needed to get ready. So there's do more with less on that. There's do more, to your point, on just really being smart about overhead. Real estate costs a lot. There is also the talent. Like when you are not a remote friendly environment, you are inherently limiting your talent pool to a particular geography, right? And the minute you do that, like if you take California or New York as an example, the cost of living, the salaries, like they are, and this is without even considering the lack of diversity of thought that you may be able to amplify if you're opening it up to everyone in the country or in the world in that context, right? And I think the more there is diversity, and in this particular instance, I'm more saying diversity of thought. Obviously, that can extend to representation and other forms. The more you infuse diversity of thought, at least in your culture, especially in a remote culture, the more it helps you challenge each other, brainstorm, see different perspectives, and collectively, if you're not commuting as much, the doing more with less is amplified on a variety of dimensions on that, right? Because you can do a lot more when you have four diverse minds trying to figure out a creative solution than four like minds who've done the same exact thing before and trying to come up with a creative solution. So I think it's really now at Paper, as I've transitioned and I've been at Paper for the last almost 4 months. We were born in the pandemic. We were a remote first company. So our entire workforce is distributed. We have almost the other challenge, I would say, for lack of better words, which is how do we try to make sure we infuse moments of in-person connection so that we can balance. The remote work does not mean like you eliminate in-person connection completely and never see each other, right? To me, remote work is not forcing someone to come in X days a week just because you have real estate or just because that's the right thing, because then you limit your geographical proximity in talent pool and intern diversity. Remote work is how do you find that happy medium between people being able to work remotely, but maybe whatever the cadence, maybe 4 times a year, twice a year, maybe once a month, depending on the team. how do you get together, even if it's for a few days, because there is value in that connectivity and collaboration. So we are at Paper trying to work through what does that mean for us. Teams do meet. Like for the last 3 months since I've started, I've been traveling twice a month to make sure I meet teams. But what is that sustainable form of doing more with less in a remote? So it was interesting because Airbnb was in person to remote overnight and then trying to figure out what works for us. At Paper, it's remote and now slowly, gradually trying to understand what is our overall philosophy in that.
Oh, that's really an interesting transition. That makes sense. One of the things when I think about doing more with less, I think that people are not really trained in our modern economy on how to do remote effectively. Managers aren't trained, employees aren't trained. So when I think about doing more with less, I think about all the topics that you brought up in terms of, you're saving a lot in real estate. In companies like the tech companies like Paper or Airbnb, the main cost after employees is real estate. So obviously, if you're facilitating remote work and you can downsize a lot of real estate, you're saving a lot on that. And you're saving a lot on talent if you can hire diverse talent from around the country, around the globe. Most of my clients hire people from the same time zones or limited time zones, but some of them, of course, hire from the global companies, hire from around the globe. So you're saving on talent that way, of course. But one of the things that I think people don't think about when you're thinking about doing more with less is specifically training your people. Because if you're more efficient, and you can tell me what you do at Airbnb and at Paper, but if they're more efficient at working remotely, at working in a flexible modality, then they do much more with less. So think about, let's say, virtual communication. One of the things that's an easy tip and an easy trick is to look at your camera when you want people to feel like they have eye contact with you, right? That's something that is really hard for people. I still am surprised by how many people, when I train them, even salespeople whose goal it is to sell, right? They struggle with that. They naturally look at the person on the screen, not at their camera when they're talking. Now, when they're not talking, when the other person's talking, of course, you want to look at the other person, you want to see their expressions, what's going on. But when you're talking, you want to make a good impression. And to do that, you really need to have eye contact. So you need to be looking at the camera. And that's just one example. There are so many aspects of virtual communication which are different than they are in person. And I don't see companies investing nearly enough into this. Then let's say virtual collaboration. How do you set common norms and expectations? You talked about yourself burning out early in the pandemic. That's a problem, right? You need to set some expectations because people, when they don't know what the expectations are, the temptation, if the desk is 2 feet away, or if the phone is like right in their bedstand, to wake up and check their phone, answer messages, and then go on with their routine and go throughout the day, work throughout the day, and then like check their phone just before going to sleep. That's not really great. What really helps, and I work with clients on doing this, is setting norms and expectations. So for example, having everyone from a set time, like let's say 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. in whatever time zone you decide is appropriate, to have quick responses, like respond within 15 minutes to a Slack message, within half an hour to an email. But outside of that time zone, you only respond quickly if someone sends you a text. And otherwise, you don't need to respond quickly until the next 11 a.m. rolls around in whatever time zone. So having that communication expectations, facilitating collaboration, I find to be really important in making more with less. So that's another aspect of training. And then let's say performance management. How can managers really evaluate performance effectively? Because the traditional method of evaluating performance is based on performativity, people being in front of you and you seeing them work, right? And that once annual performance evaluation, rather than having very clear, frequent, small-scale performance evaluations. So let's say having a weekly meeting where you talk about what are your 3 to 5 goals for the week, whether you talk about whether you break down OKRs or KPIs or whatever you use for your company into smaller scale activities that you can do for a week. What are the 3 to 5 goals you have for the week? Then the next meeting in a week, you see, okay, how did you do on those 3 to 5 goals? Any ways that you had problems, coach them in problem solving, give them an evaluation of performance, and then set 3 to 5 goals for the next week. So those are just 3 elements of training people on how to do effective work when they're working remotely to make do more with less.
Yeah, and I think all those points are so valid, right? I love the camera thing, and I'm trying to also think through like how the setup influences that, right? Like where your camera is set up is where you can look like, there's so many factors to that. I think on all those points it makes really good sense. Like even communication. So an example of it at Airbnb early in the pandemic, part of the reason I also burnt out was I also, aside from it just being a weakness of myself where I worked way too much, was also, we used Google Chat, we used Slack, we used text messaging, we used emails, and maybe phone calls and Zoom meetings. And there were too many forms of communication, and different teams leaned on different forms of communication. So even when you say that, even if you set kind of that expectation on what is time frames when you need to be more available or not, it's like you have to do that over multiple mediums of communication. Paper, for example, our primary communication tool is only Slack. And we use that, and it's unless there's an urgency, then in the rare situation you could text or call, but it's Slack across the board, which makes it easier to focus on, or even makes it easier to not work and check out if you need those few hours, because you're just going to one place, and you're not like trying to go through. Even for the performance, I think you hit it on the head. I think fundamentally what we have to double down on is how do we set the clear expectations up front of what we're expecting from individuals, because performance management is essentially just following through on that. So in remote work, it makes it a little bit, you have to be a little bit more intentional to say like, you're not in front of me. I'm not checking if you're online 8 hours a day, for example. What I'm checking on is output of deliverables. And as long as you have those continued check-ins, you can easily look at output versus time spent. And this was a learning at Airbnb. So when we were in our 2-year remote exercise, as I called it, we turned around the company from being completely to a standstill due to the pandemic and travel being halted, to really not just orchestrating one of our biggest layoffs of 2,500 people globally, all remote, to then doing a successful IPO 6 months later, all 100% remote. And when we did that 100% remote, and we looked back and said, what did we do in the last year? We were remote. How do we measure success? We started looking at it in terms of output, right? Like we were able to turn around the company. We were able to execute initiatives. We went IPO, and we're like, we need to shift our mindset to focusing more on output versus the micro, did Q sign on for 8 hours a day? Like what was Q's? And I think a lot of this comes down to manager effectiveness, really making sure managers are equipped. A lot of, especially in the tech world or startup world, a lot of first-time managers, because folks have grown in their career, that has been a way to go up. So how do you really equip and help managers to understand how can they have those regular check-ins? Like even something like having regular one-on-ones is, for us who've been in that space for a while or manage people, it's kind of second nature. But for a lot of first-time managers, it's not, unfortunately. So how do you embed those, and then you layer that on with expectations and communication channels? I think that it's no longer like, let's just see how things work out and they will play itself out. You have to be a little bit more intentional in remote work.
You absolutely do. And that's the key. I think you started this conversation saying being intentional, because remote work is not intuitive. It's not something that just comes naturally that you can easily transmit. So it's very critical to have more clear expectations, more clear communications, more clear policies, and more clear training, especially in the tech world. Like you mentioned, the first-time managers are often coming from experts who are moving up in their career, and that it makes a challenge for people who don't have that knowledge and who haven't been managed in the remote setting earlier. And so they don't know how to manage themselves, how to manage their team members, and how to deal with people in that sort of setting. So that's really important, that I think people don't know that, and they need to be trained, and there need to be communication set. And the other thing I want to mention, so we're talking about managers, another thing that I've seen Microsoft research put out a good report saying that over 85% of managers have this productivity paranoia, that they don't trust their employees to work when they're not watching them. And I think this is definitely a big issue. So I think the issue of trust is really important. Trusting people, believing that they will behave like adults, and holding them responsible to outcomes and focusing on that rather than focusing on inputs and monitoring their performance, looking at their outcomes and just trusting them to be adults and to behave and to do their work. I think that's really critical. And when you show that trust to people, you see higher engagement, higher retention, higher productivity, better morale, better well-being.
Yep. And that was, just a final note, like our remote work policy program at Airbnb that we launched in April of 2022. In the first 9 months, we saw highest engagement we've ever seen in our history. We also saw highest diversity numbers that we've had since we started tracking it. Now, again, it was all not just because of one remote work policy. It's the infrastructure and the supporting training and expectations and trust and transparency and how you empower. Like our whole program was built on, we are empowering you to select what's best. You do what's best. Just make sure you meet our high expectations of output. And when you lead with that, I think it gives you an opportunity to really empower the employees. And there will be folks that will take advantage of remote work, right? Sure. There will always be. There's bad actors no matter what you do. The key, no matter which methodology you pick. But the key is like not solving for those bad actors. And two, if there are people that are not living up to the standard, living up to your own expectation that you set and course correcting in the right form, right? Be it training, be it performance management, whatever the right solution may be at the time. Because the minute you don't do that, you start losing credibility on your own expectation that you wanted to hold people to.
Absolutely agree, Q. I think it's very, very important to not manage to the bad 10% who take advantage of remote work, to actually focus on the people who are able to work effectively remotely. And if people aren't able to perform effectively remotely, you do, like you said, course correction, and sometimes they need to be escorted off the bus, and that's fine too. That's the key. So where do you see remote work going? I mean, a number of companies are, of course, pivoting to forcing employees back to the office, and remote work is not as popular as it used to be. What do you see as the future of remote work?
I think the future work is going to continue to grow. I don't think we have to all believe that everyone will work remotely one day for this trend to continue. I think what we do have to believe, or what I do believe will happen, is that knowledge workers that are no longer need to be tethered to a geographical location will want the flexibility to choose what's best for their lives, and there will be employers that will continue to offer that. And for folks that, I think it's more a rebalance versus a pendulum, shift from one side to the other, where people will find what they like and what the environment they want to work in. Like some people may love working in person, and there's nothing wrong with that, but they will find the organization that gives them what they want. And I think remote work will continue to grow. It won't be the only way of working, but I think it's already in the last 2 or 3 years, I think it's grown 4x or 5x compared to what it was before. I think it'll continue to grow and continue to become more as one or two very productive ways to work over time.
Yeah, I'm working with my clients. That's definitely something I see. And partially, I'm observing this sector not only from the eyes of my clients, but also looking at the patents. So there have been increasing amount of patents on technology that facilitates remote work in a variety of ways, whether it's augmented reality, virtual reality, collaborative tools, and so on. We're seeing more and more tools. So I think technology is going to clearly facilitate easier remote working, where people will be able to collaborate together easier, to have those more spontaneous conversations that people miss, to have more socializing, to feel more connected, and address some of the coordination problems that do exist in remote work. So that's another thing I see in the future, that better technology will facilitate better remote work.
I mean, if you think of 30 years ago with no internet and no Zoom, remote work was harder or almost impossible. Now we have just Zoom and Slack are just the start of the technology, evolution and supporting remote work, and that's going to continue to grow.
Absolutely.
It's a great part.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Q. This was
Yeah,
really
thanks for
helpful.
having me. Yeah, it was great.